28 out of Nigeria's 36 states held governorship, and all 36 states held state houses of assembly elections on March 18th. We've seen results for around 17 states come in, and we're expecting more. We've also seen the suspension of collation in at least 2 states. In Abia, INEC staff were held hostage, and in Enugu, there were calls for a review of the results of the governorship election from the 2 outstanding local government areas of Nsukka and Nkanu East. There are a number of issues that have also come up. Many said this was the Independent National Electoral Commission's opportunity to redeem itself from the complaints and criticisms that trailed the presidential and National Assembly elections. So did INEC find redemption? Then there was the electoral violence that was witnessed in several parts of the country, leading to suppression of votes and intimidation of voters. There were also attacks on journalists, with News Central's Amading Uyi being harassed not once but twice by security operatives. While the actual voting is over, there seems to be a massive rebuilding process ahead of Nigerians and their leaders. Are we up to the task? Dr. Tobi Oluwatola, Executive Director of the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development, is my first guest tonight on Politics HQ. Dr. Oluwatola, welcome again to PHQ. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So there have been some dramatic 3 weeks or so, given the time between the presidential and, of course, now the state houses of assembly elections. And INEC took center stage once again over the weekend. And that's because, of course, the conduct, they're the electoral umpire. We're all looking to them to see if they've learned from the criticisms of the past few weeks. Some say this was the chance for the commission to redeem itself. So let me ask you, and let's start from there. Did you see an INEC that got some form of redemption over the weekend?
I saw an INEC that attempted to do better, but the entire process was a lot worse than the presidential election. And so you recall when I was here 2 weeks ago, I scored the process a 51%. I think this time I will score it a 45%. And in this time around, the buck stops. Yes, INEC is ultimately responsible for coordinating all the various multiple stakeholders that play a role in the electoral process, but several stakeholders failed in their responsibilities. And INEC may have done better where logistics are concerned, where the major Achilles heel 3 weeks ago, the uploading of results onto Beavers, onto the IREV portal, they may have done better in those respects. But on other counts that are equally important, there were lots of failures. And I'll just give a few examples. So we had about 60 observers on the field in 31 states. And we had about 109 incidents recorded.
Incidents of what?
Incidents of various things. 25% of those incidents were vote buying. And this cuts across from Sokoto to Akwa Ibom to Ogun State to Oyo State. Vote buying was everywhere in the country.
Did that also cut across political parties?
It cut across political parties as well. So in some cases it was APC, in other cases it was PDP, and in other cases it was Labour Party. It cut across all parties. But what I also wanted to highlight is, and what I thought was most grievous in what we observed this time around, is that whereas in the presidential election we had only one of our people, of our observers attacked or in some way harassed. This time around, more than 10% of our observers were harassed or attacked in one way. And I want to really highlight the story of Richard Ekele, who was observing polling unit 2, Estate Eket local government area in Akwa Ibom State. He had observed in polling unit 2 some vote buying, and he thought he had discreetly taken a picture of the vote buying process, and he had moved on to another polling unit 1, when a mob of a mixed combination of party people, but they were really a mob of thugs, just came at him where he was, dragged him out to a corner, broke his phone, looked at his phone, tried to delete the pictures, broke his phone, and then they started lynching him.
Wow.
But fortunately for him, just as that was about to happen, the local government chairman, Inyobong Benson, I believe his name is, was driving by, his convoy was driving by and saw what was happening. And he intervened, fortunately for him. So it was a close shave, and another of our observers was thrown out of a moving vehicle. So we had lots of cases of members of the press who have a constitutional duty
and a right
to keep, and these people had INEC accreditation and tags. What was security doing? What were the security forces doing? And then beyond attacks on the press, we saw a lot of violent voter suppression, bigotry, ethnic bigotry, and all sorts of pandering to the lowest, the basest levels of our sensibilities. And so in that respect, it really degraded what could have been
much better.
a better turnout.
Okay, so you've sort of listed some of the issues I want us to get into, because Festus Okoye, the INEC Commissioner, National Commissioner and Chairman for Information and Voter Education, actually highlighted on this issue of the security situation. And he said that even ad hoc staff that were both regular and ad hoc staff were victims of violence. Some of them were abducted, harassed, intimidated, even hospitalized, and in one case also killed. In a recent report, the Center for Democracy and Development said there were 109 deaths from January 1st to March the 3rd, all tied to the elections. And we witnessed this widespread electoral violence, not just in one place. Were you surprised? Because as you said, we saw you gave INEC about 51%. We did see some security situations in the presidential, but not at this level. So were you, in fact, then surprised to see the governorship elections and state houses of assembly elections now descend to such a very violent state?
I partly wasn't surprised, because historically in Nigeria's elections we've experienced these things
at this level.
At this level, because politics is local, and at the local level. But I think what also exacerbated the tensions that we felt in this particular cycle is the height to which we had elevated talk, the rhetoric around ethnicity, religion, and things like that in our polity, and we had heated up the polity to a certain level that even in Lagos State, you started hearing things like, an Igbo person is not going to be governor of Lagos, when, the Labour Party candidate really isn't an Igbo person.
There was actually no Igbo top running candidates on the ballot.
There was no Igbo person on the ballot, but we had elevated that talk and really heated up the polity in that way, that you then had lots of citizen vigilantes trying to, enforce the will of politicians, unbeknownst to them, thinking they were enforcing their religions and their ethnicity.
It's interesting you talk about that, because we've seen the videos, whether it's you are Igbo or you look Igbo or you are thought to have supported the opposition party. Lagosians, voters across Lagos were denied their franchise. They're denied their right to vote.
Absolutely.
And there are many who have warned about the fact that this rhetoric will live beyond the elections. We've finished voting, except for off-cycle elections. We're going to go into the business of governance. But these things will stick. People will remember. It lives long on social media, and it lives long in many people's hearts. And people have warned about the Rwandan genocide. They've said, look at the rhetoric we're spreading and how we can trace some of it back to how the Nazis spread the rhetoric right before the Holocaust as well. Do you think Nigeria got to a line and we're just not crossing it, or have we started putting one foot over a line that we can't go back from?
I think that we've been flirting with this line for a long time, and it was this same line of reasoning and line of argumentation that led to, the first coup and the First World War, and the Nigerian Civil War in 1967, and it's the tensions have been somewhere, the undercurrents of it has really been around for a while. I think it behoves of our leaders now to calm all nerves and to make sure that, and to restore confidence and restore faith in one Nigeria.
But do you have faith
that
in
will not
their
happen,
capability to do that?
And that will not happen if people like a spokesperson for the president is going on Twitter and saying that that Lagos State belongs to, is not no man's land, and saying very incisive rhetoric like that. That would not happen if that's happening. So I think that, that really crossed the line, and that's the kind of behavior that we cannot afford from our leaders. Citizens, you can't control what citizens say. It's free speech is, is
but
part
with
of
boundaries.
Yeah, but with boundaries. But to some extent, you can control. You as long as it's not, people are not harming you with their words. They're free to say what they want to say. If it's not, even if you disagree with what they're saying. Mm-hmm. However, leaders don't have to be circumspect when they talk, because they have a responsibility. They swear a responsibility to all Nigerians, not just to their ethnicities.
All Lagosians. All Riverins. All
leaders have to be held to a much higher standard. And that's really what the leaders, the president-elect, the governors-elect, that's the standard to which they really have to hold themselves if we're going to heal the wounds that we have already inflicted.
So I'm going to stick with this because we heard from the National Human Rights Commission that they plan to invite the Kogi State Governor Yahaya Bello, as well as the Lagos State Parks Management Committee Chairman, also known as MC Oluoma, in terms of the comments and the alleged inciting statements that they've made in the past few weeks. Now, the Kogi State Commissioner for Information has denied that the governor made the remarks, and MC Oluoma has said that he was joking. But it's not. That's not the important part for me. What's important is that we heard from the police, the Nigeria Police Force spokesman, Muyiwa Adejobi, who said that police authorities in Lagos would be investigating MC Oluoma's comments, but also basically said the video should be regarded as a joke. And he's been heavily criticized, as well as the MPF has been criticized for taking that stance. In a situation like this, the Human Rights Commission is saying they're investigating. It's after the horse has bolted from the stable. It's after these comments have incited people, and people have taken decisions based on not just his comments, but of course a number of other things. But how could this have been better handled in the days and the weeks leading up to the election?
So I think this is why I keep insisting that elections are a multi-stakeholder event. Whereas it is true that INEC bears the brunt of the responsibility because they are the lead organization, the security services also bear significant responsibility. And in the run-up to the elections, we knew the security services, the police, and the DSS knew the hotspots, knew the places where Igbo people or people or the majority of the obedience would want to vote. They knew those places, so they knew that those places would be attacked. We're going to be targets. They knew when certain kings were announcing Olu on the night of election. They knew these things, and they could have deployed more armed forces to those places, because the point of having the government have monopoly of violence and the government being there to show that they will prevent violence is really a deterrent. It's not because we want the thugs to come and then get into exchange guns, arms with the police. But if the thugs got there and they saw 10 soldiers, in the outer perimeter where they would get in and they wouldn't even let the thugs get through, then what happened would not have happened. So I think I'm putting the responsibility on the security situation solely at the feet of the security services, because even INEC, like you rightly said, even their ad hoc staff, were attacked and many were killed. So ultimately, we've got to really ask, go back to the drawing board about who the police serves. Do they serve the party in power, or do they serve the people? Who do they swear an allegiance to?
And I like the fact that you say go back to the drawing board, because that was one of the questions I was going to ask you in terms of, do we need to realign or to adjust how we look at security when it comes to elections? So what we were sold for this election was like a 3-perimeter, a 3-ring sort of conversation. Electoral Act does not allow weapons or guns in police hands within the polling units and around, which is quite understandable as well. So they're meant to be unarmed, but be a physical presence. Then there's meant to be a police unit outside of that, and the third perimeter of that was meant to be the military. But also there seems to have been an opportunity for a lack of communication. Those at the polling units, how were they meant to communicate with the second ring and the third ring? I went to VGC to cover the situation between residents of the estates and INEC, and on the way there, we passed 7 military checkpoints on Lekki Express alone. Wow. A journey that barely took us 20 minutes. And so you're wondering to yourself, if I'm seeing them here, is this replicated elsewhere? But apparently it wasn't. So do we need to change how we look at security when it comes to elections?
I think that there is wisdom to the way that security was supposed to be, the 3 concentric circles of deployment. I think the gap always comes in terms of the deployment, the actual implementation of the intent. The intent is right, that you don't want exchange of arms where there are lots of people voting. You don't want that to happen. But the police at the polling units ought to have at least walkie-talkies, ought to have telephones. They could have been able to be, there's a reason to mobilize. They could have been able to take pictures. So even if there's very little they can do, if the police is there taking pictures of the talks of people who are being disruptive, telling them, and making and calling for backup where they are overwhelmed, the deterrent effect alone was what we needed. In the end, what you want law enforcement to do is not to inflict violence, is to deter violence. And they did not act in ways as to deter violence.
And unfortunately, there are some reports that they actually, some, not all, were actually involved
we had cases where, at least 4 cases where it was in fact the security services that harassed our observers. Wow. and arrested them. In some cases it was civil defense, in some cases it was the police, and in other cases it was just the bodyguards, the security detail of a honorable gentleman who was sharing money from polling unit to polling unit, who had our observer arrested and taken away with him. So we've got to really, when the blood, the police is supposed to be the white blood cells that protects the body. When that becomes jaundiced, when that becomes sick, it's really terrific. It's hard to survive that.
So now I'm going to ask you to paint some picture, because with everything we've seen with these elections, this is the Federal Republic of Nigeria is 62 years old.
Yeah.
The democracy we're practicing now from 1999 is 23 plus years running, and everybody wants to talk about uninterrupted democracy. But we have gotten to a point where there are questions about the quality of that democracy versus the quality versus how many years it's been. Yeah. What do you think the violence we continue to see in our electoral processes, what do you think it says about the maturity of that democracy and the maturity of Nigeria as a country, as a republic as it stands?
So I think that we, as much as critical as we ought to be of this recent elections that we're prosecuting, I think that we've also got to take a long view. And if we're taking a long view, we will realize that we are making, even albeit tentative progress, we're making some progress. Because a lot of what we've experienced both 4 days ago and today are not necessarily new, and the prevalence of these occurrences are not necessarily new. What is the problem is that we are aspiring to better. Mm-hmm. And we hope that, and all over the world, democracy, there's the Freedom House that released a report that said democracy is in decline around the world. So there's a common sort of, trend around the world of democracy in decline. But what we've got to really recognize with Nigeria is that, yes, our democracy is not where it ought to be. But we we've got to also recognize that it's better than where it once was. Whilst we work hard together to get it to a place where we want it to be. So it's more, we have to work together. We have to really, really resist the temptation of falling into the trap of the people who want to call a dog a bad name so that they can kill it, rather than, try to mend it. So we've got to really think about, what do we need to mend about our democracy? Certain things are working a little better. We are in a place where we no longer, first of all, we no longer have the vestiges of the military era in our democracy as much anymore. None of the candidates at the presidential level was a former military leader. So that's progress. Secondly, we've got the bimodal voter aggregation system, which now limits the ability of people to just write results willy-nilly like they did in the past, like they did in elections in the past. So that's progress as well. Now we have new problems that are surfacing of vote buying, of voter suppression, of bigotry. We've got to start to ask ourselves, how do we solve these new problems? And when they do arise, and we've got to also be humble and to look at the rest of the world, that even in places as democracies as advanced as the US, there's a lot of voter suppression. It's just the gerrymandering. There's a lot of where black people are. You have to present your mother's birth certificate and everything about you to vote. So it's we've got to realize that politicians will do what politicians can get away with to win. Power doesn't yield easily.
It doesn't. And
political parties really have to start becoming more than just a platform for
a special purpose
vehicle for getting election. They have to start doing their jobs. It's the job of political parties. Education of agents down the line and the people is really the job of political parties. We've got to start having, in a lot of cases, the reason why politicians can get away with forging numbers at the polling unit level is because they can bribe the political party agents of the opposition parties, because they are not really members of the party. They're really just ad hoc volunteers who are only doing the job because they're getting paid. So we've got to get to the point where our democracy starts to mature. We start to have a process of educating, bringing people into political parties, educating them in the philosophy and the doctrine of the party that is beyond just how do we quickly win elections. It's the doctrine of, if it's the APC, it looks like, they want to sell the doctrine of we are the party of the masses. We are the party that tries to distribute the wealth.
Yes.
They want to sell them. Let's bring people in on that basis. If you're the, if you're the PDP and you want to bring people on the basis of conservative values and private sector enterprise, bring people in on that basis and groom your people down the line on that basis. And if we can mature our democracy in that way, I think we're making tentative progress.
All right, Dr. Oluwatola, before I let you go, when we spoke, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, ahead of this election, we talked about voter apathy and turnout.
Yes.
Turnout at the presidential election was abysmal, but there were other issues because people did also have accusations of intimidation and suppression and votes not counting. Then we now saw what happened on Saturday. And in certain places, people just did not show up. But then even those who showed up, if you take a Lagos, for example, depending on where you were in Lagos, there was intimidation, there was violence. That made it difficult to vote or see your vote through. In the long run, there's still a country to run. There's still governance that needs to come into play after this whole election season and all of that. How much of the lack of turnout can we tie to apathy versus possible intimidation and suppression that we saw?
No, I think there certainly was a lot of apathy. At the beginning of the day when we were observing what was going on across the country, what we definitely realized was that there was a depressed turnout. And a lot of that could be indicative of a loss of confidence in the process that happened 3 weeks ago. But I think that in the end, like I said, democracy is a journey. It's and this is a bus stop in that journey. We continue to see we continue to educate the people. We continue to, we just continue have to continue doing this job from the media to civil society organizations, to politicians. We've just got to continue doing this job because ultimately democracy is for the people. And if the people's voices, if we don't have a quorum of the people's voices involved in democracy, then what we're really practicing is an oligarchy.
So how do you think that the events of this election season, both the presidential, National Assembly, state governorship, as well as state houses of assembly, how do you think it will impact future elections, particularly given the changing demographics we've seen around the country, the rise of young Nigerians on the political scene, the number of first-time voters we saw, the number of youth voters we saw, the lack of belief and confidence in INEC? That seems to be an overarching theme at this point in time. How do you think that's going to affect us as we go into other elections?
I think that there's a positive here because between 2019 and 2015 and today, a lot of work went into reforming the Electoral Act that civil society together with INEC and legislature worked together on. I think what has happened between now up till now, between 2000 the NSAS movement and now, is that young voices have now. Lots of young voices have now come into the room. And those young voices are going to start to demand another reform. The same way, civil society, people like Yaga demanded not too young to run and demanded the Electoral Act being reformed. We are going to have to be taking a lot of lessons from this election that will be taken into future elections. And I think that what we need to be looking at is the new legislature and the role that they have to play now in making sure that all these lessons that we are learning, we're incorporating them as we head towards 2027. And not just 2027, the mid-cycle, off-cycle elections that come in between, because what happens from here on out is what will determine if that confidence will start getting restored. If we take those lessons, if there is accountability, where there has been people who committed electoral malpractices, people who committed electoral violence, if there is very clear accountability, and we then take some of the lessons that we learned into reforming the act, reforming the guidelines of INEC, I think that we can start to gain more the confidence of the youth again, that by 2027 we get better turnouts.
All right, so we'll leave the conversation at that. I know the quote is that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, but I think for our situation, we'll turn it to the price of democracy is the eternal vigilance that Nigerians must continue to have. Dr. Tobi Oluwatola, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Tolu, and thank you to the audience.
Executive Director of the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development. When we come back on Politics HQ, we'll drill down further into some of the results from the states, as well as some of the other issues that have come up in line with Nigeria's elections. Stay with us.